Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for showing up so late in the afternoon on the second day of a conference. I know that's tough for some of you, but you'll be glad you came here today because this is going to be an exciting panel. We've got very, very accomplished journalists to talk about various aspects of biosecurity, biosafety, covering COVID, all sorts of things. I did want to say one of the journalists. Sorry, again. This is not working. Okay. Now maybe we all can hear me. One of the journalists who's supposed to be here today, Kai Kupfer-Schmidt, has had an emergency, couldn't make it here today, and Sarah Knapton has agreed to fill in for him. So if you've got an old agenda, you know, that Sarah is filling in. And as I said, I think this is going to be maybe one of the more interesting of the panels, just because we're journalists and most of you are experts in various aspects of biosecurity. And I think when you listen to the people up here, you get some semblance of, well, journalists think a little bit different about these things than maybe some of you do. And I think we'll be able to pull back a curtain a little bit and give you a little bit of an inside look at how journalists think, how they work, and how you can work with them if you're an expert. Let me real quickly give short introductions here. Down at the end is Katherine Eban. She's a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and a very accomplished investigative journalist and author. Sarah Knapton is science editor at the Daily Telegraph, and Natasha Loder is the health editor at the Economist. And I'd really first just like to, rather than avoid the elephant that's standing here in the room, I think we're going to talk first about the COVID-19 origins debate. It's kind of ridiculous to avoid it with 4 journalists up here, and including people who have covered it at great length and wonderfully, I believe. So I'm just going to ask you all, in turn, first of all, explain for the people here what it is you've done, sort of a really quick recap of how you've covered the origins debate, what you've done, and then anything just that you think is noteworthy, something that our experts may find interesting or surprising or maybe even slightly horrifying, because it has been a very, very contentious debate. So, Katherine, throw it to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just great to be up here with colleagues whose work I really respect and admire so much, and to be here with all of you. I first began reporting on COVID origins in the spring of 2021, and it really came from an informal conversation with my editor, where we had been covering COVID from the start of the outbreak at Vanity Fair, and we were sort of putting our heads together discussion, and he said, well, what are the big unanswered questions of the pandemic? And he sort of answered his own question, and he was like, where it came from. And I was like, okay, yeah, that would be interesting. Let's look into that. Well, I'm still standing 2 years later, and I have done a number of deep dive stories on that. And it has been really covering it. Maybe the good news is it's been a story like no other. I'm told we don't have a week for this answer, so I will try to keep the remarks on the shorter side. First of all, when you, in reporting, when you put out information, it is the typical experience that you will get information back. And sometimes the more information you put out, the more you will get back. And so, in coverage of everything from 9/11 to the anthrax attacks to CIA interrogations, you will get tips that come in all forms once you start reporting and basically announce your presence. But there is a kind of silence at the heart of this story, which I think is very challenging for journalists. I mean, in a normal story, if there was such a thing, we would by now be inundated with, whistleblowers from the Huanan seafood market, or whistleblowers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the market worker, the lab tech. You would have audit reports and internal memos and, WhatsApp messages and all kinds, webcam videos and all kinds of things that are, challengingly absent in this story at this point. So that makes it a very, very challenging story for journalists to cover. I like to think that once I really get into a project of length, sort of the ratio that I am comfortable with is that I will use 1/10 of what is in my notebook, and 9/10 winds up on the cutting room floor because you're distilling things and winding up with the most critical information. But in this case, there is a sort of paucity of information in the public square. There is, information in China that we still don't have access to. There is information in the intelligence community that we still don't have access to. And so I think that absence of information, or information that is slow to come, has been challenging both for scientists and for journalists. So that has been, and then a lot of the information that is in the public domain is fiercely contested information as to what it means, as to how important it is, which has left journalists with the job of having to sort of thread their way through that information, often with great difficulty. So that is something that is really unique about this story. The other thing that is, I think, unique, at least in my experience of this story, is that, journalists are every bit as competitive as scientists, and we always want to be first. But in this case, it's been my experience that the journalists who are covering this topic have begun to talk to one another, because it is such a difficult story, and many of the journalists that I've spoken to say it is the most challenging story they have ever covered. And we have sort of talked about how you approach a story like this, how it's important to really ground the reporting in documents, in real-world events, not just in speculation and hypothesis. So we have sometimes commiserated, well, if we could all just work together, maybe we'd actually get somewhere. And maybe we should, I don't know.
But, good luck with that. Yeah.
But those are just a couple of the things that really stand out to me as unique in covering this very, very challenging, but very critical, very important story, in my view.
Okay, thanks, Katherine. Sarah, sort of same question to you. How did you get into covering the origins debate, and anything that you found perhaps a bit strange about doing it?
Yeah, thanks for that. I got asked to do this over 4 glasses of wine last night, so apologies that I'm not absolutely on top of it as much as these two. So I'm a daily news journalist, so I cover all areas of science. And so as soon as we knew that there was something happening in China, we started looking at it and did all the press conferences. And then I remember getting an email from our Chinese correspondent on January the 20th, 2020. And the sequence had just come out at that point, and she said there's this rumor flying around that it may have come from this lab in Wuhan. They were looking at bat coronaviruses. It seems very close to it. Someone had published a preprint. It's the start of this glut of preprints that were coming out and would confuse everyone, saying that there was, I think that was the one that said there may have been some sort of HIV insertion into it. The FCS, I don't think had come out at that point. But there was clearly something there, and within sort of a few hours, I was being told from China, from my Chinese team, oh, don't worry about it, it's a conspiracy theory, no one's looking into it, we're being told on the ground, it's nothing, it's nonsense. And I sort of thought, well, yeah, but you can't just leave it like that. So I started going to the people that I would usually respect, and still do respect. I mean, I don't think there was any agenda there, and sort of saying, can you take a look at the sequence for us? Is there anything there that suggests foul play, anything a bit dodgy? They all came back to me, absolutely not. There's nothing in this. They said to me the technology doesn't even exist to create something like this that could have leaked from a lab. It's just not possible. Which kind of I don't think was true. I'm not sure that the people who told me that necessarily knew that for sure. But the problem was those people were people that I really trusted, and I didn't know where to go after that to find anything out. And within a couple of months, we were in lockdown anyway. So I think that was one of the problems of reporting the pandemic. It was kind of like you were in a war, but a war where you couldn't do any war reporting on because you weren't allowed out in the scene. You couldn't get to China. You couldn't get really out and about to talk to anyone. And I think the other problem was, I think the lab leak got conflated by the fact the engineered virus versus the fact that it may have just been a collected bat virus that then just accidentally spilled out. I think those two things got conflated very early, and everyone thought that the lab leak had gone away because the engineered virus had gone away, and so people sort of shut it down. But yeah, I think even now I feel quite disappointed in some of the scientists who I really trusted from big institutions, Imperial, UCL, Cambridge, Oxford, who just told me that there was no way this could have happened, when you don't even have to start looking through the literature very far to find where this has happened multiple times before, in China, in Britain, foot and mouth in Britain. It does happen. And so to dismiss it so quickly, I found very surprising. I think it's done a lot of damage. And I think Trump hasn't helped. So I think that was a problem, that it seemed to come from the Trump administration. And I don't think until Trump stepped down, anyone really looked at it properly. Anyone was willing to stand, put their heads above the parapet and look at it properly. And I think when Nicholas Wade's article came out, I think that did a lot of good. And then the letter in Science from a lot of you here saying that it wasn't a fringe theory anymore, and suddenly you were allowed to talk about it. And since then, I don't think there's been as much as of a chilling effect as there was in that first 18 months. But it's been very hard to report on. And I felt quite exposed as a journalist in Fleet Street. I'm about the only, I think me and Ian Birrell at the Mail are about the only, and Natasha are about the only people that are really doing it in Britain.
Yeah, I think that feeling of being out there, on the gangplank, waiting for somebody to push you off is pretty universal for journalists reporting from all aspects of this. But Natasha, why don't you give us your...
My sort of potted summary. So I'm a health journalist, and again, like Sarah, I write about a very wide range of topics. I'd heard the stories about lab leaks, by February of 2020. And my reaction was, well, that's interesting, but do we have any good reason to think that there was anything wrong with this laboratory? And my sort of rudimentary poking around at the time made me think, well, I don't see a good reason to be worried about this lab. And so it wasn't really until the Washington cables, the Wuhan cables came out, that it sort of came up on my radar again, and I felt like certainly I and other people in the office felt that it was time to do the story. And I was lucky enough to share an office with the defense correspondent, and he pointed me in the direction of Philippa Lentsos, and we wrote our first piece. And I'm an ecologist by training. I've written about emerging diseases for years. I've written about zoonoses for years. I've interviewed Peter Daszak and enjoyed his company. There you go. There's an admission for you all over many years. And that first piece we wrote did, of course, talk about zoonoses. It did mention the word conspiracy theories, but we also spent about 25% of that piece talking very squarely about, a sort of non-natural origin, a lab origin, we talked about the furin cleavage site. That was April 2020. And although I've swung backwards and forwards on where I think the weight of evidence lies, I'm now firmly on the fence. Don't ask me. I don't know. I have no idea. I do think, I've lost my thread there. But in any case, I think, we have a responsibility to keep asking these questions. I haven't done that many stories. When we do them, I'll do a deep dive and then I'll move on to do something else. Sometimes I'll get a call from the desk, the news desk, they'll say, can you do an explainer on the origin of COVID in 700 words, please, for 2 days? So you get these challenges, and as a journalist, you have to rise to them, and they're not necessarily how you would choose to cover them, but those are the things that you're asked to do. I don't get bylines, so you won't really generally be able to look me up like Katherine or Sarah Knapton. That's just the way that The Economist works. Yes, it is the hardest story I have ever worked on. It's partly to do with the silence. It's also to do with the kind of prominence of the story. Now, at The Economist, I would find that people would return my emails, people who are at the heart of a hot story. That's not necessarily the case with a story like this. It may be that, Eddie Holmes has spoken to CNN and the BBC, and he hasn't got time to speak to me. And all that I will see are the few clips that they decide to use. And I don't have the benefit of the long interview that he's given or that someone else has given or if Philippa is quoted in the media. And so there is a problem there in kind of keeping up. And, the sort of method of communication that we have, maybe we can talk about that in sometime later, has not been great. So it's been hard. And then lastly, one of the most unusual things, I'm used to getting criticism as a journalist, right? And, it's part of the job. And it's fine for people to criticize like how I've covered a story. And of course, everyone's like, oh, you gave too much prominence to this. You made this factual error. You spelled this guy's name wrong. Whatever it is, it's fine. What is difficult about this story is when you are personally attacked as a journalist, your motives are questioned, you're being told that you have an opinion, you've pre-formulated opinion, you're told that you do not have enough expertise to even ask the question. You can't ask that question. You don't know what you're talking about. And this all sort of like raises the game for being able to participate in this story, and that makes it very difficult.
Yeah, and you sort of led right where I wanted to go, which is this story, me personally, no idea what the origin of COVID-19 was. And I think generally, that's pretty much where it is right now, but through reporting, just essentially that. The levels of attacks and taking sides with politics mixed in was really it was disconcerting, but more than that, it buried the story. The search for the truth of this, it took a year before really the media was coming back to seriously look at, what's going on here. And so what I'd like, you all in turn, again, to talk about, well, what lessons can we draw from this? Move a little bit more forward looking. We're gonna have more outbreaks. We're gonna have things that get politicized and whatever. What lessons are there for both journalists and scientists about how we can have a better discussion that explains to the public more effectively than what has happened here, the state of play of this inquiry? And so, Natasha, why don't you go first, since we've...
Are we going to do scientists or journalists or both?
Why don't we do scientists first, and then we'll come back and grill ourselves.
Okay, well, let's talk about scientists, because actually there was one point I didn't make, actually, which sort of touches on this as well, in that, you know, for most of the stories that I cover, the questions are amenable really to sort of the scientific process, and they're kind of, you can crack them open. But you know, here the real curveball we've got is like the intelligence services and the sort of this information that they have that we don't have. And that kind of adds a whole nother dimension to the story. And so, you know, you can cover the science story, but then you can be missing the bigger picture. And so I suppose the lesson for scientists is that, you know, there is an additional dimension to this story. This isn't just a story about science. That's one of the things I would say. The lessons for scientists, well, one of the biggest lessons I've learned for you all is be polite on Twitter, okay? Right? Because it reflects really badly on you, and you may think you're being clever, but you're not. And, you know, it is, I'm sure journalists are infuriating. I'm sure I personally am infuriating. I'm sure my questions are infuriating. I'm sure lots of conspiracy theorists on Twitter are infuriating. But, you know, what is it? Well, you know, when they go low, we go high, right? And there is a certain level of expectation from the public that scientists do occupy some ivory tower, some moral high ground. No, you know, you don't, right? You're humans just like us. But I think that it's a mistake to hang everything out there on Twitter. I really do, and I think you shouldn't do that. One of the things I've really struggled with, and this is about access to information. And what I don't understand is, like, you know, you may give an hour-long interview with a journalist, and they'll use, like, you know, 3 lines of your quote. Well, why would you not just record it on Otter or something and then put the transcript up? Or put something on your website saying, I just spoke to a journalist and these are the things we talked about. If you think about what it's like to cover a fast-moving story, and it's like, well, I have to wait until you publish something, or you're going to tweet like 280 characters. So I just sort of think, like, if you are willing to spend time with 1 or 2 journalists, then why not share that with everyone? Because then that's knowledge and information we can all use, right? What are my other lessons? Well, recognize the legitimacy of the questions about where this thing came from. And I mean, I suppose I'm speaking to an audience that's kind of more receptive to this. But, you know, there are certain conferences I could go to where the scientists would be quite upset, perhaps, at being continued to ask, well, could it have been a lab leak? And, you know, that's something that I just have to deal with. I have to deal with that, but, you know, it would be good if you as scientists could create the culture where that's allowed. Sorry, I'm doing too much of the talking, and I may take all your points. Yeah, I'll let you guys answer some more of the questions.
Yeah, we'll see if Sarah's got...
Yeah, what she said. I think one of the main problems, and this wasn't just a lab leak problem, this was an entire COVID problem, was groupthink. And scientists got into their kind of pack mentality. This is what I saw. Maybe you didn't, from the inside, maybe it felt differently. But there was definitely groups, and almost organized groups that, especially as Natasha said on Twitter, were really doing their best to shut down debate.
Yes.
And trying to pick your way through that, it felt like you were going a bit mad at times, because you were like, this is a legitimate question. And 10 people now have started sort of a Twitch hunt against me, and I'm trying to defend myself, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And it was awful. And, you know, especially in the UK, there was groups that were specifically set up to do that. You know, Independent Sage, we know, was set up by the Citizens, which was a political organisation, which they themselves said Indie Sage was an experimental stealth project. They said it was. They say that themselves. So I think there was a problem with that. I think too many scientists waded into areas that they knew nothing about. It was one of those problems, I think, trying to get hold of people in the pandemic. You just heard the word scientist, and it was like, that was good enough to get on Sky. You know, you might be a biologist, but suddenly you were commenting on, you know, something that was completely outside of your field, just having an opinion, and that suddenly turned into scientific fact when you were a big head on Sky News. So I think that's a really important point. And then if you don't know something, just say so. You know, you don't need to kind of make up an answer or deflect from it or say, oh, that's definitely not the case if you just don't know. If you just don't know something, say so. We would rather know that. That's as much as an answer as anything else. So they would be my 3 points, I think.
Okay, Katherine.
Yeah. So I would say, early on in the pandemic, many scientists were really uncertain about the origins of COVID. They did not know, and a number of them suspected it may have come from a laboratory. They were raising questions about, unsafe research that was being done at low biocontainment levels. Many of those scientists expressed their doubts privately, and publicly, they basically said, well, it looks like a zoonosis. It's just a typical. This is just sort of a playbook spillover, albeit a very bad one. And we really didn't learn that those scientists had their own doubts until there were leaks to the press. There was FOIA litigation, Freedom of Information litigation, and emails came out. And I can imagine that for scientists who were having their emails FOIA'd, it's a very unsettling, difficult experience. But I also think that for the public, it was a difficult experience, sort of an exercise in cognitive dissonance to hear one thing and then actually see another view entirely being expressed. And I think it's a kind of useful thought exercise to say, what if the NIH had come out early on and said, we don't know, we're not sure. We have these doubts, here's why we have these doubts. We are going to continue to look into this, the science is going to evolve, we're going to move with the science, and we'll get back to you with our latest thinking. And meanwhile, China, could you please hand over, this necessary data? And, that would have put the NIH really where it should have been, which was at the forefront of seeking information, rather than being in the position of guarding information and being, blanketed with FOIA requests and releasing FOIA documents where, whole pages are blacked out. I don't think that is a good exercise for science. I don't think that was a good exercise for our, leading scientific agency. And so I think that, transparency is a good lesson to take away from that. You might ask yourself, well, given the information environment we're all living in, would you really want to get up and say, I don't know? To that, I would say, there are some scientists in this room who have done that. They've really done that. They've done that very bravely, and they've suffered attacks for it. So we know from that model that it is possible for scientists to express doubt and uncertainty. I think that has served the public well, in my opinion.
Okay, after we journalists have, put scientists on the rack here for a while, which we're always willing to say bad things about other people, but I think it's time to talk about how could the journalism have been better? I mean, this was an issue where, for a long period of time, many mainstream outlets hewed to one story that really wasn't the whole story. And I'm just curious, what do you all think about, well, how could journalists have approached this differently? Is there a way we could have made it not get mixed up in the politics and the division and not be a you're on one side or the other side kind of issue? Or is it just, is this a sui generis thing? Is this just so unique that, no, there aren't really any lessons for journalists? What do you think, Natasha?
Well, I mean, journalists are a really diverse bunch, and it's very hard to come up with sort of hard and fast rules. And the question you're asking me is from a sort of very particular context. It's from a US context. And I hear again and again this narrative about how the sort of politics thwarted the discussion. But I don't swim in that water, and I never did. And it never really mattered to me that it was the Trump administration that had said that there was this evidence. It didn't, all due respect to the concerns about racism being stimulated that just wasn't a conversation that was happening in the UK. I never needed to censor myself. I never needed to say, I'm not allowed to ask this question because I am pushing a Trump agenda or I'm being racist in asking this question. And so it's very much context dependent. Now, it's hard for journalists who work within certain contexts, because remember, okay, all journalists feel a responsibility to the story, but also we feel a responsibility to our readers, and our readers have certain expectations, and that gets filtered through to our editors. And so it's hard for a lot of journalists to jump out of the water they're swimming in, or even to see the water that they're swimming in. So that's a really bad answer, I'm afraid. I would say there are no simple answers. I would say the one thing I would like scientists to understand about journalists is that our interests don't always align with yours. And I'm sure you know that. I mean, that's kind of pretty self-evident. But we still need your help. And we can't tell the truth if you don't answer our calls, if you're not brave enough. There are people who are brave and they do talk to us. They talk to us in confidence on background. You don't need to go on the record. But, you have to speak up. And I know it's controversial and it's difficult and you'd rather not get involved and you're very busy. But people have to do that. So I would just say, look, it's difficult as a journalist, but if we work together, I think we can get better coverage.
I think generally good journalists and good scientists and experts, they overlap a lot in a real quest for truth and facts. So, Sarah, what could we do better in this kind of really contentious situation to work together with, good-meaning scientists?
Actually, I was going to say the exact opposite, that we shouldn't be doing that. We're not science communicators. I think there's a problem that is happening a lot in science journalism at the moment, in that science journalism is becoming science communication. And scientists are almost seeing science journalists as their marketing department to get out their work. And journalists, that isn't their job. We should be challenging scientists to tell us why they've come up with this, what the confounders are and why they've done it like this and not like that. I just don't think there's enough challenge of science. Scientists are often held up as these kind of, bastions of truth, and we've seen through the pandemic that's not always the case. They have agendas too, they get things wrong too. And journalists need to be questioning that. And I also think science journalism in general is just horribly under-resourced. I mean, when the pandemic started, there was one science journalist at the Telegraph, one health journalist at the Telegraph in news, trying to cover that whole thing. It was just impossible. And it's not something that a normal a general reporter can do. They don't have the expertise to look through a scientific paper and understand what that means. So you really need that niche specialism to be able to do it. And the resources are not there anymore. So I think from that perspective, I think we almost need to go I would say we need to go the other way, and science journalists need to be a bit more tough about challenging some of the science.
Katherine, what can we do better?
Well, I have a relative who does a lot of business in China, and I'm very fond of him. And early on in the pandemic, and I had really just started my coverage, and he was like, everybody in China, all my business colleagues are saying it came from a lab. And he started explaining to me, he's like, there's this lab and it's really close to this market. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, well, first of all, that is just ridiculous. And then I'm thinking, I wonder what his information sources are. God, he can't differentiate, the New York Times from, a supermarket tabloid. So, I pretty much dismissed that out of hand. And then, Trump went on to make his infamous, relatively fact-free statements about, we know it came from a lab, and that was, at the White House podium in April of 2020. And, at that point, the story was just developed a kind of, and I hate to say it, but a real ick factor for the mainstream media. As I had one source who said to me that, there was like an antibody response inside the US government. And, nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to be on that side. Nobody wanted to be allied with an agenda that was, certainly in the US, seen as harmful to Asian Americans, but racist, xenophobic. So then you go and you start reporting on the possibility of a laboratory leak. And, you're like in a low-rent neighborhood. You're just looking around and, are you really reporting this? Like, who are you talking to? Who are your sources? And, it is a very challenging place for a journalist to be. But I guess what I would say for journalists is, even when there is a toxic messenger, you still have to ask questions. You still have to do your homework. When I started reporting, what I found out pretty quickly was there are non-crazy people inside the US government who actually think it was a lab leak, and they were asking questions, and those questions got buried for a whole range of reasons. That was my first story on the topic. So I think, I would say try to set aside the sort of milieu of the story, try to really delve into the questions and tease out the facts, and then be as unafraid as possible to report what you find, so long as it is, done as accurately and fairly as you can.
Yeah, I'd like to turn real quickly here away from COVID origins slightly. It's really not away from it, but to a degree it is. Gain of function has become almost a boogeyman, right? People say gain of function, it's supposed to be something evil, something wrong, bad, whatever. And I really haven't seen all that much in the way of decent reporting on the difference between different kinds of research that might or might not be termed gain of function and, the relative value of any of them. And I just wondered, again, I'll just go down the line, Natasha, but how do you think journalists should be approaching gain of function right now?
I think none of them should be covering it at all, and they should leave it to me, because that's why I'm here. Sorry, you wanted a serious answer. How do I think they should be covering it? There absolutely is. It's the key question, isn't it? Is, what do we allow and what do we not allow? And actually, can we even not allow some stuff, right? It's like, is it even in our capacity to do that?
How could you regulate that?
But from a journalistic perspective, the way I would look at that story is to say, the public will be really interested to hear about research that is going on to benefit them, that might not benefit them. And isn't it fascinating that, the risks and the benefits of doing some of this research are not necessarily aligned with the public interest? And that's a really kind of key idea, is that, a scientist may decide to, tinker with H5N1 virus and publish it and say, this is really important, we do this. But the public at large may be like, in fact, scientists at large may be kind of horrified by this. And so I think it's really important that we find a way of alerting the public to the fact that this work is being done paid by them on their behalf, but actually their interests may not be perfectly aligned with the scientists, and that's something that they need to take an interest in.
Yeah, Sarah, I mean, from a daily newspaper point of view, these kind of really complicated scientific issues must be a real bear to deal with. I mean, how would, in your position, you know, somebody comes up and says, hey, do a story about gain of function. I mean...
I would say if you met Natasha from The Economist, she'll do it for you. Yeah, it's difficult. I think, though, there's ways of simplifying things down, and I think the public will go along with you if you keep them informed. I think it's when you don't inform them that they get suspicious that there's something going on behind the scenes. So, for example, there's a genetic engineering bill that's just passed through Parliament in the UK with a whimper. Not, you know, no one's been arguing about it. No one sort of said it shouldn't be happening. You know, we can now have genetically engineered food if we want. If that had happened sort of 10 years ago without all the work that's been going on and all the positivity towards that, I think there would be protests in the streets and you know. But so taking the public with you is the way to do that. But I think as well, I think gain of function. I was talking to Peter Daszak about it actually, and his definition of gain of function, I was asking him whether if you know, they had engineered a bat coronavirus, whether that would have counted as gain of function, and he told me it wouldn't have, because bat coronaviruses couldn't have infected humans in the first place. So it just seemed really disingenuous, sort of circular argument that you could be doing some work that essentially put something in that would make something very infectious to humans, but because it wasn't infectious to humans beforehand, that wouldn't count. And the way he explained it to me is under NIH rules, that is the current explanation, which I think it's that sort of thing that the public gets really suspicious about and thinks if you're being that disingenuous about and getting around things with mealy-mouthed wording, what else are you keeping from us? So I think that's a problem that we're going to have to address at some point.
Yeah, Katherine, is there a way to rescue gain of function from being the boogeyman? I mean, there are different kinds of research, and some of it is important to do, you know, and that's cast under this shadow of, ooh, gain of function. Is there a way for journalism to deal with this that doesn't distort the bejesus out of it?
Well, you know, first of all, I think reporting on this story, it is very easy to get trapped by these phrases because you need a succinct way to describe something, but of course the phrases very often don't convey meaning. So, I mean, I think for journalists, you know, you want to be able to write a story that would not necessarily have to use any of those terms. I mean, you could explain it in plain language and then say, you know, which some people refer to as gain-of-function research. But, you know, having spent 2 years trying to figure out how to explain a furin cleavage site in a single sentence, and by the way, tip to journalists, this was the lesson for journalists, if you figure out how to do that, keep repeating it in every single story because you're allowed to plagiarize yourself. You know, so, but I just think that it is important to, you know, get more granular in what one is describing. So, you know, gain-of-function research of concern. You know, what is that? What is gain of function, which, as one person said to me, is like all of virology, you know. You know, but to try to get both more granular and more accessible in the language that we use as science communicators.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, is that, you know, what you mean by gain of function is not what everybody is, what does everyone else understand by that?
Yeah, as soon as you all come up with the furin cleavage site accessible explanation, let me know. Okay.
But, I mean, I think the public is perfectly willing to accept that there's lots of virology that is perfectly fine and is worth doing. That's not the issue. The issue is defining the boundaries of what is acceptable and what isn't. And I don't think that you guys have a good handle on that, judging by what I've heard.
Okay.
You don't know where to draw the line.
When you say you, who are you talking about?
This conference.
This conference.
You don't know where the line is or should be drawn, or even how to define the line, or what the line looks like for that matter. I mean, there's no consensus. And so if you're expecting a sort of coherent line in my journalism, to emerge, you're asking me to solve your problems. I can't do that. Right? So, you come up with a much clearer way of defining what research, the risks and the benefits, and how we should proceed. And then we'll have a much clearer message. I mean, maybe I will solve your problem for you, but you shouldn't count on it.
Okay, thank you all. This is wonderful conversation up to now, but I think it's time to go to the audience and questions. And let me look, boy, lots of questions here. I think that gentleman there, where January is handing him the microphone. If you all would identify yourselves in a short affiliation.
Okay, so my name is Jonathan Latham, and I'm a virologist by training. I brought up an issue yesterday, and I made a request to the organizers that I could pursue this idea a little bit further, and they kindly agreed. And so they gave me this little spot to do this, and it is a communication issue in part. So I think it's appropriate here. So first, thank you. Secondly, yesterday I discussed how successful reform efforts in the technocratic sphere pretty much require an inside effort and an outside effort. So these are two groups that differ in almost every conceivable way, but they share a common goal, making them in principle a coalition. Now, many factors drive them apart, and one of those is deliberate establishment strategies, and I talked a tiny bit about that yesterday, so I won't do that again. But the biggest single threat to this coalition is, in my opinion, that people on the inside get perceived as stooges, right, or patsies. So they maybe have a genuine interest in changing the system and in improving biosafety in this case, and so on and so forth. But the view from the outside, from Twitter and the media, and people who are not in this room and not privy to these conversations, do not necessarily know how to judge what's going on the inside. It's very difficult. So there's a trust issue, right? So the solution to this, in my opinion, is that people on the inside have to actively demonstrate in a determined and thoughtful way their sincerity, right? It's a difficult problem because you've got people on the outside who lack technical knowledge. They have so many difficulties. And so the problem for the people on the inside is not to lose the trust of those people so that they then disappear and then no longer form part of the coalition. They're not the noisy people on the outside that you need who have a concern, who make the noise. So my suggestion is that the way for people on the inside to solve that problem is to step outside of the tram lines that are set by the establishment norms. Okay, so this requires a certain courage on the part of the people on the inside. And I have two suggestions for this. So the first one is that many people perceive that some kind of international institution is seen as needed to build capacity and oversee improvements in global biosafety. Now, my suggestion is that this institution should not be housed at the World Health Organization, right? So in this community, in this room, the credibility of that World Health Organization may be very high. But in the wider world, the credibility of the World Health Organization is close to zero. And this is where the wisdom of the crowd becomes interesting, because the World Health Organization is effectively controlled by the US government, the Chinese government.
Oh my goodness.
Hold on just a little bit here. What I need you to do is come to a question, please.
We're just about
I'll let you go on for like 3 solid minutes.
Yeah.
Do you have a question for us?
No, I'm just about finished. I wasn't asking for a question, actually, when I discussed
this
with
is
the
a
organizers.
question and answer, period.
Yes, I understand. But you keep, the organizers of this meeting keep asking for feedback from the audience. Want to hear from the audience, and so we hear this in every session. And so I'm now offering that. And I'm not saying that my opinion of the credibility of the WHO Okay, I think you misunderstood.
What I'm saying
talking
is
about
you made your one point, and you said there were two. If you could move on to point number two, and then we're going to have to wrap up pretty quickly.
I'm nearly done. Thank you. So the WHO is essentially controlled by the Gates Foundation, by Big Pharma, so on and so forth. That is the perception of people on the outside. And I would say that reflects actually a certain wisdom. And so if people on the outside want to step out of the trend lines, one option is to say that housing this organization in the WHO would be inappropriate. So it would be
you've already said you want this organization to be outside of the WHO.
Yeah.
What's your second point, please?
The second point is to ask the question, who should run this organization, right? If it's not the WHO, who should do it? And my suggestion would be that it should be the scientist whose credibility has gone up the most in the whole of this pandemic. And my suggestion for that would be Richard Ebright. And that would be he already runs an institution. And what the world needs is a scientist with credibility who actually has concerns about these issues to run that organization. So I'm just about finished. I'm just pointing out that these are controversial things. They will be challenging for people in this room. But it requires going outside and tapping into information and stepping away from the ivory tower that most of us live in to think about these issues. So I've said enough. I'm just putting forward a suggestion. Don't have to take it, but I'd like you to listen. Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Thank you. January, I guess the closest to you is down at the end over there.
Hi, Gustavo Palacios from Mount Sinai. I want to ask this question regarding, I think that journalists and scientists are very similar in the fact that what our more treasure is our reputation. Whenever we lost credibility in what we say, there is a cost. So most scientists are very cautious to talk about what they don't know for certain. What I don't understand is when a journalist receives information or that is misinformation, where it finds out that it's being told lies, or when it's clear that there is a very strong spin in what they are receiving from a source, why we are always hearing the same sources? Why there is not a change in the sources that we are looking for information when we have been told misinformation, if you want, when we find out that some things had been hidden from a journalist? I don't understand that piece, because it should work in the other way. If you find out that someone have exaggerated, you will not use it as a source.
Okay.
Well, there's a difference between misinformation and lies, right? And so if someone's lied to you, obviously you don't use them again. There's also misinformation. Then there's people who perhaps have a strong belief but also agenda. Mr. Latham, I thought that many of your comments were riddled with misinformation, and I don't agree with many of the things that you said. So, and all you can do is just make a decision about how credible that person is and decide whether to use them again. You presumably have an example in mind. It would be useful to know who you're talking about. Who are we using in the media that you think we shouldn't be using? Right.
Okay.
But so that does, I will admit to you that the people who haven't been, and it is difficult. And, when Richard Ebright emailed me about his new biosafety initiative, I said, thank you very much. I think this is a very important initiative. But by the way, I do think you need to be more polite on Twitter, because I think it undermines the good work you're doing. Didn't get a reply. Now, there are situations where, if he is still the world expert in something, you may talk to him. I would find it difficult to quote him after watching how he has behaved on Twitter, but I couldn't rule it out. If the story required it, you have to go to these people. The same with Peter Daszak. He's still one of the world's expert on zoonoses. You know, you can't necessarily rule these people out. And that's why I would encourage scientists to be polite on Twitter, because when they're not, you certainly do have to draw back a little.
Yeah, Katherine, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think, you know, just speaking generally, it can be, you know, I'm a magazine journalist and I do long form reporting, so I tend to have more time for my stories. But I think, you know, speaking as a former newspaper journalist, it can be very challenging when time is of the essence, and you know, you essentially have a group of sources that you have on speed dial. You know, you reach out to them under a deadline pressure, but I think it can be very problematic, as you point out, to keep going back to the same sources. And I do think it is the obligation of the journalist to diversify the perspectives in your story. I think that's incredibly important. So I think, you know, I think your point is a good one.
Okay. I think this lady right here, I'm sorry, I
Yes.
can't call you by names because I can't see that.
That's no problem. My name is Melissa Salm. I'm an anthropologist of science and a biosecurity fellow at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. I'm really curious about your thoughts as journalists on conspiracy theories and how you make sense of them as an alternative mode of storytelling, but also as like a way to unauthorize and stigmatize some narratives. And what role did conspiracy theories play in shaping and reshaping the narrative in an uncertain environment?
Who wants to take that?
You should take that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should.
So first of all, it's a great question. It's a really complicated question and answer, I think, for every journalist writing about COVID. I mean, we are literally in a landscape that is, you know, awash with conspiracy theories, and every journalist pretty much is on Twitter, which is like doubly and triply awash in conspiracy theories. I mean, I have written specifically about, you know, anti-vaxxer conspiracy theories, the possibility that we might be looking at an environment in the US where one of two political parties is actually aligned with the anti-vax movement. I mean, we're, you know, possibly headed towards that, so it's very ominous. I would say on the topic of COVID origins, you know, to the extent possible, it is really, really important to sort of disentangle the you know, different types of information and the different sources of those information, and to do it specifically in your stories. So, you know, just because you're talking about a lab leak does not mean you are talking about a bioweapon being cooked up, you know, in the back of the Wib by Anthony Fauci. You know, those are very different things. And so it's really the job of the journalist to communicate sort of the full register of difference in these things floating around in the atmosphere, is what I would say.
I did want to point out that in this particular story, a big thing at play was to make out the journalists who were asking the question, could it be a lab leak, to make them into conspiracy freaks of some kind. And that was a thing that some scientists did very clearly on purpose. And I think that's worth some study at CSAC over there. You might take a look at that. Yeah, we've got about 2.5 minutes there, so this gentleman in the back there, because the microphone just happens to be close to you.
Just quickly, for me, the unique and novel feature of covering this story has been the importance of unconventional sources. Amateur investigators, internet sleuths, citizen scientists, whatever you call them, people like the seeker, Francisco Ribera, the engineer, Gilles Desmaneuf, coming up with much more important revelations than a lot of conventional sources have. I think that's a very interesting feature of journalism.
It is a very interesting feature, but it also created a lot of rabbit holes. Right? And so had you been following all of that very closely, you would have spent a lot of time worrying about a mine in the Mohang mine. And so without wishing to devalue what they're doing in any way at all, because I agree with you, they have surfaced some important information, but information is not knowledge. And so, that's the problem you still have of sifting all this stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say that sifting the wheat from the chaff in this has been an absolute nightmare. I mean, for every conspiracy theory that's turned out to be true, another 20 have turned out to be nonsense. So just trying to work out. I remember one early in the pandemic that suggested the reason why black people were getting infected more and suffering worse symptoms was because scientists had been experimenting on HeLa cells in the lab, and it's crackers, but that was doing the rounds for a long time. So it was really difficult, and I think for every drastic, we're good at digging out some stuff. There's been organisations you would ordinarily have not liked to work with. You've been sort of forced to in a way because the sources who should have been doing this haven't been doing their job. So it's a difficult one, and I've lost a lot of trust in science over this, in scientists, and I hope it comes back, but
Keep the faith.
yeah.
Okay, the clock here is telling me I have 15 seconds to thank all you, really, for coming to the conference and for being such a great audience. I wish I had 20 more minutes to take your questions, I really do. But I'll be out there, so will the other journalists, buttonhole us, ask us all these questions that I see bottled up here that could be asked. Thank you, and I'm supposed to introduce at this point our speaker for our keynote speaker, and of course I was handed a little card that's had all the information about him, and it's disappeared somewhere. So I know it's Mark Lipsitch of Harvard is going to come up and talk to you now, but thanks again, y'all were a great audience.